Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Design of Sound tonight. It's with considerable excitement that I stand before you tonight, because as an architect, this is quite a unique opportunity to actually understand something that we don't often deal with. That is the minutiae of making instruments and of music. I mean, obviously, Design of Sound has been about all sorts of acoustic things. And actually, we haven't really looked at performance yet. We've looked at how to frame it. Well, we haven't actually looked from the other side. And as an architect, when we design a concert hall, we design them like musical instruments, or us architects who like to think we're good at it do anyway. And we say, oh, we worry about the wood, we worry about diffusion, we worry about acoustic panels, we worry about materiality. But I don't think any of us have ever really stopped to actually think about what actually goes into making a musical instrument. How the different resonant panels work out with each other, what the materiality is, what the molecular structure of the timbers are. And so tonight, I'm really, really excited to actually say we're going to learn about that. So with no further ado, can I introduce Benjamin Hebbert.
Thank you very much. I'm actually as excited to talk to all you as Paul says is excited for me to be talking, because as someone who works with musical instruments, who's been an instrument maker, and now there's other things with it, it's really sort of exciting to see where other perspectives are, and to sort of look a little left of field and see where other ideas can come from. Violin making particularly is one of those things where the minutiae that we can get into is absolutely it's so phenomenally sort of great that I could very easily give you more than an hour's lecture on just one small component of the violin. So I decided instead that I'd be incredibly superficial and just skirt over really three big things. One is design, one is the materials, and finally the sound. And as you were very lucky, I'd like to introduce Tim Wright, who's sitting at the front. Who's going to be playing some of the instruments so that you get a real sense of the sound that's involved in instrument making. It's an interesting thing, I think, as concert hall designers, you're interested in the music, you're interested in the production values of what an orchestra has produced. That in itself comes from what the musicians are able to give as musicians, as performers, but what they're able to do as performer is all very much sort of resident in what the instruments are. And I picked this image particularly because, being the inside of a double bass, it does look surprisingly like an architectural space. And there's that sort of complete circle that we go from a room within a room through various things. So maybe this will inspire you in ways which are unexpected in terms of thinking about a performing space and a space which gives sound. I don't want to get so far into the design of the violin, but I just want to give you an idea of what's happened over the last 5 or 6 centuries. The amazing thing is these objects that you see right here are effectively unchanged from things that you could even see in Europe in the late 15th century. We talk about the violin being invented around about the 1560s, but I think you see here, for example, this is actually from 1513. This is a fresco in a church in Ferrara, and you see already that there are highly developed instruments which look very, very similar to the kind of violin that we know today. In fact, this tells us a great deal about early 16th century ideas of musical instruments. These are all frescoes from the dome of the church. What we see is actually, just in this small section, we see obviously something that looks like a cello, and I think that's very sort of familiar for all of us. But we see another bowed instrument here, there's another one up there, there's the back of another one that you can see. Actually, what Gaudenzo Ferrara has done, which is quite clever, is that he's showing not only all sorts of different designs, one of which happens to be very similar to the modern violin, But when we look at the decorations of these, we see that as a painter, he's tried to impose the same decorations in the building of the instruments, which gives us the idea that these are maybe by the same maker or out of the same workshop, and certainly made at the same time. So your image of 16th century, sort of early 16th century, pre the violin, kind of violin-y kind of things, is actually that if you looked at angels in this case, or if you looked into the real life court of a Renaissance prince, you'd find string instruments existing of every single possible sort of shape and size and order. This is from 1511, this is one of the great survivors from that early period. Again, it's very, very violin-like. And there's actually something which, it's a shame I haven't put this slide right at the end of the talk as well, because there's something amazingly anthropomorphic about this instrument, and that's something very, very important when we start to look at the sound of the instrument. You've actually got at the front, hopefully you can see in this light on a very bad image, but you can actually see the chest and the loins of a human being carved in the front. You can certainly see the face on the back. And there's very much this idea within this instrument that it is an instrument which is human in many more senses than just simply being a box of wood. We'll get to that. That's a very, very important point which has come far too early in the lecture. By the middle of the 16th century, all of these instruments here, incidentally, are in the Ashmolean Museum. And these show as wide a spread of ideas which are competing throughout the 16th century. You can see right at the top we've got something which is very similar to a modern violin. In fact, it is a modern violin in most senses. But you see that amongst these, the two smaller instruments at the top and the one furthest away from me, those are all by Gaspar da Sala. He works in a city called Brescia. And he's the person who is not necessarily the inventor of the violin, but is in this frustrating position that when the violin, as we know it, is invented, is already the most established workman building musical instruments in the whole of northern Italy. Somebody else gets to him with a better idea. You can see from those three instruments, just in one workshop, there's an amazing diversification of designs which are happening. And latterly, of course, he then goes and follows up and becomes the second great maker of violins after the 1560s. The sort of jelly bean shaped instrument, second from the right, is also made by a Brescian maker, Giovanni Maria. And these two towards this side are made in London, but showing a sort of continuity of ideas which are not just completely different shapes competing with each other, but also very high quality instruments being made throughout Europe. What these instruments have, which arguably the instruments that we've looked at earlier don't have, is, and this is where architecture becomes very important, is that with every single one of these examples, you can find an architecture, or at least a geometrical or proportional scheme which defines the way that the shapes of these instruments work. So just in the same way that most classical architecture can be brought down to, well, all classical architecture can be brought down to mathematical schemes, the same is true of these instruments. I can show you from England two very good examples. This is a proportional scheme which starts with, I really want to go through this very quickly, and it's really for effect rather than to get into it, because I'm just going to give you a 2-hour lecture in 2 minutes here. But starting with a sort of a root, which is the measurement that I define as A in here. This is some research that I did sometime earlier. Just starting with drawing a line on a piece of paper which is that long, using first of all Pythagoras to make our first transition, and then from this moment using, Pythagoras is famous for two things. He's famous for triangles. He's also famous for working out the difference of interval between musical notes. So using that part of Pythagoras' mathematical brain, we can start to make circles and squares and things. And as I say, I'm going through this really superficially in order to show you the kind of things which are happening in England and in Italy at this time. And there, by the time we get to that, that's a bass viol made in Southwark, not very far from the George Inn, in 1619. And with that, always using proportion. All sorts of ideas happen, so that even when we see things that are different, we can find some route to different proportional ideas within them. Here's another one which I just wanted to show you. Very, very simple idea of using rectangle proportions of 2 to 3, which is a perfect fit in music. And the joy of this very sophisticated way of, well, actually quite simple way of creating an instrument is that actually we've used two proportions only in order to create this instrument. Everything's been done with compasses and rules. 5 to 6 is your perfect fifth. Your perfect fifth is the last, if you take a piano keyboard and you press 2 notes together, a perfect fifth is the furthest distance between two different notes where those notes are going to sound harmoniously together. And 2 to 3, which is a minor third, is the closest 2 notes which you can press together and get harmoniously together. So actually what you're seeing there is a kind of a musical composition based on proportions which are inbuilt into Pythagoras' idea of what music is. And just using those two very simple ideas, building up the whole of the musical instrument shape. Those are English. What's really interesting is that somebody else has been working on Italian works. These have all got to do with proportion. And so all the architectural ideas behind English instruments of the 16th century is proportion. Everything that happens in Italy is geometrical. And there's absolutely no crossover between the two. They're both very cleverly used in different parts of an architect's portfolio of ideas in order to create very, very separate things. But with this competition, there's one thing that happens in 1565, and that's that in France there's a series of court masques, so great big sort of triumphal celebrations, rather like sort of the royal wedding was a few years ago, in which all sorts of heads of state come over to France. These are conducted by Catherine de Medici, and whose son-in-law is King Charles IX of France. And amazingly, from that point, we get these instruments. I say Gaspar de Salo, who I spoke about, who works in Brescia, is the old established instrument maker in northern Italy. In 1564, a guy called Andrea Marti in Cremona gets the contract to supply these instruments for these court festivities. This is one of them. This is a cello called The King, and you can see that and behind is a painting by Antoine Caron, who was the sort of the stage designer for these great festivities. And you can see that the iconography and the stage design and the iconography on the back of the cello is exactly the same. And that really links these instruments not just into France, but into this very specific thing happening at this specific time. Because there's so many people from so many different countries in France at that time, all reporting back at this cultural extravaganza, they bring back the idea of the violin, and specifically of the Cremona violin that's being witnessed in France for the first time. By the end of the 1560s, we see evidence of Italian musicians, Italian instruments being hired by courts throughout Europe, from Brussels, from Munich, in London, in Poland, in In fact, if you go to school in Poland, you're taught that the Polish invented the violin, and we just find that they just come the year after this all happens in France, and it's because there were Polish diplomats at the court of Charles IX who were able to see these things. So competition in terms of in terms of different ideas of making a violin or any related thing suddenly stops in the 1560s, and it's from this point on towards right the way through to the modern time that design stays still. It's a design which is geometrical. It's the best possible way of creating the general designs that you see at that point. I think when we look at 1513, these are great shapes, but they're not justified by geometry. They're certainly not justified by architectural rules. But when we see these things, and this is the one which has got the date, 1564, when we see these things, they are justified by architectural rules. So in a Renaissance mindset, these are right whether others are not necessarily right at all. I think in terms of sound, there's something very important, that if you look into a Renaissance mindset, there is a natural assumption that if this is made using geometry, which is in turn is derived from divine proportions and so forth, the sound which you get out of this kind of thing, almost by definition, is going to be the perfect sound. Because it has to be, because the geometry is perfect, the architecture is perfect, and the metaphor towards something which is holy, which in the middle of the 16th century makes a lot more sense than it does today, actually means that there's a point at which architecture and geometry rules the instrument and guarantees that it's right. Even though that sounds kind of strange coming from a 21st century speaker. So here we are in Haarlem in 1621. Paintings of violins as they existed at that in the 16th century are just very rare, because the fashions of painting meant that these were just, until about the 1620s, very rarely do you get still lifes with things. But by this time you get something which is fully fledged violin, absolutely in the Italian style, appearing in a merchant's painting from the middle of Holland, and really a sort of a good demonstration of how these things have become universal, how they've become endemic throughout Europe, not just in the courts of Europe, but throughout merchant classes and beyond. So by the 1620s, the violin absolutely exists as something throughout Europe, and that's what people base music on, and because of that, that's really the foundations to the problems of how you're going to contain music in a space, because these things exist already. There are big changes, and this one, although this is from 1564, it's been modernized. So for all intents and purposes, this is how a violin looks today. On the other side, you have a violin as it would have existed back in that time. So that's the second generation of makers in Cremona, this amazing Italian town that makes violins. And that's in completely original condition. Now, I could, again, I've given lectures at the Royal College of Music about the difference of between these things, and those lectures go on for hours. So I thought that I'd kind of dilute that lecture into one slide, trying to give you an idea of what the difference is. And so here we go. I figure you all know more about tennis than you do about the violin. The strange thing about tennis rackets is they're strung with exactly the same things that violins are. There's an old tennis racket, it's strung with catgut, which is actually sinews of sheep's guts. It's got nothing to do with cats, apart from that Catalonia in Spain is a huge place where these are imported from. It's a product that takes high tensions, but it doesn't take very high tensions. What we all know from tennis is that you can't hit a ball at 100 miles an hour with a wooden tennis racket with gut strings. but you can if you've got a titanium racket, which has come because the strings, which are now nylon, are able to take greater tensions. As the strings take greater tensions, you suddenly get to a point where the racket has to be redesigned because the strings are actually the thing that lead design. As those take higher tensions, you get to a point where if you put these strings on that racket, it would collapse. So now you've got to redesign the racket a little bit in order to do that. We've managed to do some very, very clever little ways of redesigning things. We angle the neck in a slightly different way. There's a certain amount of rebuilding that goes on inside these, but we keep it absolutely intact. We just make it more playable. This is a violin that you could win Wimbledon on, and that's a violin sort of that you could play lawn tennis with. And what I thought right at the moment, we'll have a very quick musical interlude, because this violin here, I think some of you've heard because I've got a 17th century violin, which might be playing well. This is a 17th century violin, which is there to prove another point. But Tim, could we hear the difference? This is not what Tim will win Wimbledon on. This is made in London in about the 1670s. It's got catgut strings like an old tennis racket, and it gives a very beautiful sound.
Mówisz o Chile first.
That's your violin, which can hit a ball at 100 miles an hour, and that's very graceful, 30 miles an hour. Probably better for tennis fine play. But the difference that you're hearing is all about the tension of strings, the ability of those strings to be able to respond in a different way. And that gives instruments a lot more spark and a lot more capability. I don't know if you got the impression that when Tim played the first violin, he was actually sort of fairly close to the limits of what that violin could play. If he tried to really sort of push down on the strings and create anything which was anything other than pedestrian, I'm not saying the plane's pedestrian, then the violin wouldn't be able to support that. So the whole mindset of producing of composition and of violin playing in the 17th century is to a large part dictated by instruments which really are only able to do so much. And when we see what spectacular sort of virtuosic playing which happens in through the 19th and 20th century, that's very much because the same violin in fact, can give more. And that's not just important in terms of how clever a musician is when they're on stage, but if you think about the great symphonies, if you think of what Stravinsky, people like that are producing, then because they've got things which can create great sounds, they're producing much bigger sounds than would have been imaginable. It's not simply that that they've got bigger concert halls with larger numbers of musicians, but actually musician to musician they're able to produce 4 or 5 times the power in their instruments that was ever conceivable in the Baroque period. So I want to look now slightly at the materials in which the instruments are made to try to sort of understand how these things work as resonating chambers, that's not a glib use of an architectural word, that's the word that we as instrument makers use to describe the properties of a violin. Amazingly, a violin is fundamentally made out of 2 woods. That's a maple tree, and that's a fir tree of some sort. And the wood kind of comes out a bit like that. What's really fascinating is that, again, I could give a lecture for over an hour about the acoustical properties of these instruments based on what I know in the 21st century. But people came to these decisions about wood a very long time ago. Here are 3 instruments. There's a cittern from northern Italy made in 1550. There's the Violetta of St. Catherine de Figri, which was made somewhere around about 1450. There's this lovely thing in the British Museum which is made out of boxwood with a softwood top, which is made in around about 1330. And consistent with the violin, if it's not maple and spruce, it's still it's the same choice of hardwood or softwood. This is your spruce front of the violin, and everything that you can see in terms of the back, the sides, the neck, the scroll of this is made out of maple. And that violin is made in 1663, the one in pieces. Violins for 100 years already have been made out of that combination. But what we can see here is even 100 years before that. Further, those things are still being used. It's not just really impressive instruments. We think that this was I think it's Richard II for whom this English sit-off, the really finely decorated one, was made. These aren't, and this belonged to someone who became a saint in northern Italy. It's not just important people and so your court culture, your sort of elite culture, where these traditions are going. Because when the Mary Rose sank in 1545, some of the things that came down were these very simple violins or fiddles, which were made by carpenters for the sailors' use. And given what was available to them, they've gone to extraordinary efforts to have hardwood backs and sides and softwood fronts, which is exactly what's happening with violins. It's the same property. So by 1545, these ideas are not just already old, but they're endemic throughout all stratas of culture. So it's something which is firmly believed. We can go back to the Sutton Hoo lyre in the 7th century, or the Trossingen lyre, which is from the 6th century. And what we find again is the same thing. We've got softwood on the top, and we've got hardwood on the bottom. In fact, by this time, hardwood, of course, is more durable, so you get the sides, you get the extra bits, anything that needs to be strong is made out of hardwood, but it's fundamentally the back everything's hardwood apart from the top, which is softwood. But if it's impressive that we can go right the way back to the 6th century and see exactly the same technology, and not only impressive, but it really sort of suggests that there's no point in you trying to find an intelligent dialogue for why we use these. Yes, there is an intelligent 21st century dialogue, but that's not what people were thinking in the 6th century. We can go to the 5th century to Coptic Egypt, and we see exactly the same thing. We can go to 3rd to 4th century Rome, and we can find exactly the same formula as well. We can go to frescoes from Herculaneum and Pompeii, and you see very consistently when you see lyres, you see a different coloration in the painting for the sides than you can for the top, and that just gels into this idea that a Roman lyre in when our year 0 AD is still going along the same ideas, and you can go even further because from 2500 BC from Sumeria, the golden lyre of Ur has got exactly the same ideas behind that. So rather than trying to find the physics behind this, interesting though they are, there's something that is actually quite ancient. However, in around 1348, Conrad von Meidengren did write about why instruments are made the way they are. From a modern scientific point of view, this is absolutely ludicrous, but he says that fir wood, so that's fir wood is pine, it's a softwood, is its porousness and looseness of texture make it very resonant when it is struck. When it is hollowed out, it is not therefore sonorous because its porousness does not permit the air to be contained. So basically they're saying it's a bit like a sponge. For which reason the bellies of string instruments, when they say belly they mean the whole body of the string instrument, such as fiddles, lyres, monochords and others such are not successful if they're made from fir wood. So if you make the entire thing out of pine, it's not going to be successful. But the soundboards are best made from fir wood because they gradually admit the air into vibration with the instrument through their loose texture. So he's saying that whatever sound is built up within the instrument can go through that porous sponge and won't really be affected by it, and that's why you get good sound. There's other texts which talk about the reflectiveness of wood, and certainly by the time you get to Francis Bacon around 1600, you've got this idea of the reflectiveness of hardwood, combined with Conrad von Meidengren's ideas, which are still valid even in the 17th century, as the reason, as the intellectual reason why we make instruments the way that we did. So you've got your very reflective, very hard body of an instrument. Now you've got separate ribs from a back, but actually this could be one entire plank dug out, as we find in medieval music. And then you have your very soft, porous cap on top of it, which kind of restricts the sound from coming out and creates your music. It's that lovely, lovely medieval logic, which is so right and so perfect, except that science has completely different explanations for it today. But I think on that, that's the same slide. That's right. From going to that, I want to sort of ask how we accidentally come by these sorts of things. And I've got two little metaphors which I want to show you, which are extremely important for understanding how the violin works. So for the first one, to understand fir, I first did this in a child's lecture, and I realised it was vastly inappropriate to have things like handguns in a thing about violins. But I wonder if anybody knows what this aeroplane is.
It's called a spruce goose.
Exactly, it's a spruce. Exactly. So this is the spruce goose, which is invented. Here you see it again, absolutely massive. Invented by Howard Hughes, who you can see here. This is the biggest aircraft in the world, and you can see it by comparison to a 747 and other incredibly big things. This is an idea which comes out of World War II. Only one is ever produced, and that's still in America somewhere. It's an aircraft big enough to take tanks across the Atlantic. So it's got size, strength, durability, everything is about this. And the secret weapon that allows something like this to be made is that it's not made out of aluminium or anything like that. It's made out of spruce, because spruce of all materials has the highest strength to weight ratio of any wood and of any naturally occurring substance whatsoever. So that allows you, because clearly people have tried all sorts of different materials, but when they come to spruce, it's the one that works. Balsa, for example, is lighter, but you couldn't put pressure on a balsa wood top that you can on spruce because it's much stronger. So at some point, people discover, without knowing the material science behind it, that things made out of spruce don't break so easily. Spruce is also very, very common. So it's not surprising that very early on we begin to see spruce as the material which is favoured in instrument making, where there's a high degree of durability, a high degree of strength, because there's about 30 kilograms of pressure, downward pressure from the strings pushing onto the body of an instrument. So it needs to have something that's strong and durable. So now the question is maple, and this is the last time when I was giving this lecture to kids where I realised I'd made a terrible error. What's the story of maple? Well, I think it's the story of Beretta, actually, and it goes a little bit further than that. There's a town in Italy called Brescia, and it's where Gaspar di Salo lived. Remember Brescia because it'll be very important later. Brescia's in the foothills of the Alps. In the Alps, directly above Brescia, is the only place in the Italian peninsula where you can economically mine iron and copper, which means that even when you go to the Iron Age, Brescia is an incredibly important iron working place. This is Brescian bronze from around about, whenever it says, 1st century. Even in the Roman times, this is the premier place in the whole of Italy for producing metal. This is Brescia in about 1400. And what you get because of metalwork is, at the beginning of the Renaissance, well, by the Renaissance, even in the medieval times, is weapons. And so why Beretta? Well, Beretta has been producing weapons since the 1400s in Brescia. So all of these things have in common is that they're the finest, most reliable weapons, apart from a viola of some sort, that coming out of Italy at their respective times, and it's because there are metalworkers there. As a violin maker, well, as someone who taught violin making in a college, people come along with the cheapest possible tools they can, and we try to, these are horrible blue Stanley bits and so forth, and we try to get them to put those in the bin as quickly as possible, because what they find is that tools, even today, most tools will not hold their blade well enough to be able to work with very hard woods. Even maple is too hard. The number of times that I've seen tools go in the bin because they can't carve maple in the 21st century is really quite astonishing. So you cannot carve maple. You certainly cannot carve harder woods unless you've got a supply of tools, which is the very best. You've got in Brescia, this town on the foothills of the Alps, you've got the best weapons makers in the whole of Europe. And because they're the best weapons makers in the whole of Europe, their ability to provide tool steel, weapon steel, in order to allow musical instrument makers to use the hardest woods possible, is something which is almost unique to that particular city. And that's why from the 1490s onwards we know that the major place for making musical instruments is Brescia. And anywhere else, such as Milan, where we see some musical instrument making using hardwoods, again there's a weapons industry there. And there's this complete link between successful instrument making and weapons production. And that's because instrument makers need tools of a standard that no ordinary blacksmith would be able to produce. So what we've got here is we've got two materials. We've got a material which has got the lowest density and has the highest strength to weight ratio, spruce. And we've got actually the hardest materials to carve that are possible in the 16th, 17th century in the form of maple. There's something really amazing, which we see in modern day, which is actually what this sort of arrives at, and that is the principle of woofers and tweeters. It's a long time since I had what hi-fi is a 16-year-old, but that's woofers and tweeters. If you take a hi-fi stereo apart, you'll find that there's two speakers. There's your woofer, the big one, which deals with low frequencies, and your tweeter is a little speaker which works incredibly well with high frequencies. When you're listening to a good hi-fi, it's the fact that those two speakers are working simultaneously. One is richer at one part, the other's richer at the other part, and it's a mixture of those two sounds which gives you your high fidelity sound, which is worth paying money for. You've got exactly the same here. This is low density spruce, and therefore it works exceptionally well at low frequencies. And this is high density maple, and it works exceptionally well at high frequencies. When you put the two of them together in exactly the same way that hi-fis use the woofers and tweeters, you have that combination of resonances which gives you your hi-fi sound. So this is the early hi-fi. There's just one thing in design which, and this is where we're going to begin to listen to more music than anything else, I hope, is the absurdity of the violin. And I think when I first realised this, it sort of came to a point of thinking, well, actually, whoever invented the violin must have been either so obsessed with an idea or just so mad that, because there's a fundamental design flaw which makes the violin not an effective instrument. And what that is that it's parallel. It's entirely symmetrical. If we compare, now there's two things. There's one good thing about symmetricality, and that is that in terms of playing the violin, all of the strings are the same, are exactly the same distance. And that means that using your hand around the strings, you don't have to shift in any awkward ways. You've got the same, to make different notes, you've got the same relative hand positions on each string, whichever one it is. That makes it a profoundly more versatile instrument than string instruments which are not symmetrical. So the violin, the guitar, the lute, and all of those, they all have this symmetricality, which is good. Something like a harp works on the principle that the strings that are highest pitched are the short ones, and the ones which are the lowest pitched are long ones. And that's what you see on the harp, that's what you see on the piano, it's what you see on harpsichords. This is a harpsichord from 1490. And that actually, in terms of physics, is what's clever. As you watch a violin being played, the further up the fingerboard, the shorter that the violin makes the notes, the higher in pitch they are. And they're just replicating this kind of idea. you take an instrument like the harpsichord, like the piano's gone through a lot of changes, so I want to keep that out because there's a lot of artificial stuff happening. Certainly the harpsichord, the harp is a very good example, is that actually there's a monotony because you can use exactly the same string and make it just smaller and smaller using the same string of the same mass, the same diameter, of the same tension, and throughout the instrument that should give you exactly the same sound but just at different pitches. And actually there's an awful lot of instruments, the pipe organ's a really good example there, it's a wind instrument where you get a monotony of sound throughout everything. And actually the human mind finds that difficult to deal with. It's very nice to listen to a pipe organ for 5 minutes, but actually it psychologically begins to damage you if you listen to it for a bit too long. And that's why you get pipe organs now in cathedrals and churches which have got all different varieties of sounds, because at the point where monotony sets in, you can pull another lever and get a completely different sound, which is again monotonous in its own right, until you find another sound or until you stop. The harpsichord, again, it has the same thing, it's just a plink, plink, plink right the way through the scale. Even harpsichord players tell me that doing the entire unaccompanied bark is not something that they ever want to do, because the monotony of doing 3 hours of no sort of undulation and sound. It doesn't matter with the harpsichord how hard you hit the key, it still gives you the same plink at the same volume with the same characteristics. A very, very beautiful sound when used in small doses. What you get here is this inbuilt, because you've got this inbuilt symmetry, which actually goes further to the inside things. This is a guitar from the inside, and it's basically symmetrical. I know it's not symmetrical, but it's basically symmetrical, bear with me. When you take the violin, you've got this thing, the one strut which goes down to support me. This sits underneath the bridge. It sits underneath where the bass side notes go transmit into the body, and it helps to boost all the bass frequencies to get into the whole of the instrument. You'll see on the other side, just about here, there's a pillar which goes from the bridge of the instrument and directly sort of connects that to the back of the instrument here, in order to directly connect the higher frequencies to the back of the instrument, so it works properly. If you lose that post, your violin sounds a little bit odd. Everything about this is this inbuilt asymmetry. Where that becomes, this is 19th century working with the harmonics of plate resonance, and this is just taking a metal plate and seeing what happens at different frequencies. So here you can see that plate, you put a little bit of sand on it and you run a bow across it until it starts to vibrate, and depending on the pitch it will form different patterns, and those are those patterns. What we see with that asymmetry when we apply it to the violin is that this is at different frequencies, the same thing happening that you begin to form patterns. And from these patterns you can see how, in the asymmetry of it all, of these patterns, you can see that there might be a perfect violin shape which takes account of these, which actually looks a bit like this. Which is a little bit ugly. This is acoustically conditioned to what we see in these plate patterns, but that's neither particularly appealing for the eye, and it's also not particularly appealing for sound, because we begin to get, when we listen to these instruments, we begin to get this monotony. There's nothing which is changing. So, would you prefer that or something like this? there's a reason for this, and this is where Tim can help us more than anything, than anyone, is that what we're looking for in sound is, I think this is sort of a really important thing for every aspect of the subject that you're studying as well as me, is that what naturally appeals to us as a sort of a caveman instinct is the sound of the human voice. None of our voices, not even mine after this many minutes, is that monotonous, I hope. By comparison to what pure monotony can be. What appeals to us, we're conditioned to our own voices. We love our own voices. We love the voices of other people that we hear. That's our elementary conditioning as human beings, is that we can't get past that point. So therefore, if you have something which is essentially the same note throughout, that's not the way our voices work. If you, when you're in the bath tonight, or the shower, or whatever, if you try to sing the lowest note that you can, you'll find that the entire timbre of that note is very different from the highest note that you can sing. And actually there's a whole range of expressiveness that comes through the different pitches of your voice from low to high. The bizarre thing about the violin is that because it's symmetrical, it needs to make these compromises, and that's why you've got this strange stuff going on the inside. It's also why the lower strings are thicker than the higher strings, and all of that creates a sort of an inbuilt imperfection which happens to map the human voice. I think, Tim, if you could. Now, I've said that Brescia is a very important place, and I've mentioned Gaspar di Salo quite a few times as not the inventor of the violin, but as the preeminent instrument maker in the middle of the 16th century at the time that the violin was invented. So, unfortunately, I don't have anything by him, but this is made by his apprentice, Giovanni Paolo Magini, and it was made in about 1610. So, in context, Shakespeare was writing The Tempest when this violin was being made. And I thought there couldn't be a better thing to demonstrate the violin. I think what could be really interesting is to just sort of do a slow G major scale to sort of get the things out of it. Are much tighter and much more constrained, which is exactly the way that the human voice goes. What gives the violin a bit more dexterity is because you've got the four strings. Each of them are of different masses, they've got different material properties. So actually, you can play the same note on different strings and get a completely different sensation from each. So
I was just thinking about that. There's a piece by the French composer Ravel, and the whole first page is completely unaccompanied violin, and you just only use the bottom string, and you go up to the very, 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 very top, and then you come all the way back down again. And that top note actually is such a sort of unique sort of sound to the violin, but you can play that note on any of the four strings, and it sounds completely different. So maybe if I play a little bit of it, that would be brilliant. notes that kind of howls. However, that can be played on the very, very top string, very easily here. And it can be used as part of a Mozart piece. So it's a completely different sort of sound, and it gives you just a huge range of expressive capability. Sort of finding different colours. And, of course, I've missed out the middle two strings. There are sort of obviously sort of subtleties in between the two extremes. There's another piece which I was thinking of as you were talking, which is the Bruch Violin concerto, which many of you may well know. It's very famous. And the opening of it is just a very simple arpeggio that happens on the violin. And I was thinking, as you were talking, if those same notes were played on the piano, there's really not very many notes in that, and I think it can be very, very expressive. If those notes were played on the piano, I don't think they would sound anywhere near as, they wouldn't affect you in the same way. I think it's the violin and its sound sort of, and how that changes sort of as you rise through it, that kind of keeps your ear interested.
There's actually something, if you just play the first note of the Bruch violin concerto, if you were to play that on a piano, you're simply putting however you put your finger down on the piano, that's all you've got.
It's like when you pluck the string. Once you plucked it, you can't do anything, it's just...
But I sort of think, someone once described to me the first bar of the Bruch as an entire cadenza on one note, because actually every single moment that you're playing it, you're thinking of a different new way to play it over just 3 or 4 seconds, less than that. If you I think that note, it's like someone waking up in the morning, if people actually didn't roll out of bed, but that way that we always imagine that everybody else gets out of bed and wakes up, or something like that. But just within one note, you're able to, there's a huge gamut of human expression. And actually, in terms of concert halls, that's the finesse of just one note, which is so important to be able to hear that as well underneath the violins in the concert, because in that's essentially it's a humanity of the violin, which is what so many people in classical music are wanting to be able to hear when they come to the concert. And I think sort of questions, but would you like to play something before we have questions, just for fun? It stops people from asking too much.
Well, I'll finish off the piece, I think.
engaging as that. I have a question, if that's all right. I mean, that was a really engaging lecture. I really enjoyed it. But could you just tell us a little bit about the spaces that these instruments were designed for? Because the relationship between actual music production and space sort of has worked reciprocally over the ages. So when these were first invented, they weren't big consoles we have today. Could you tell us a little bit about what you know about that?
It's amazing how things have changed, and actually I think it's something which is quite important thinking of places. I mean, when that violin was made, Galileo was writing to Monteverdi, who was recommending Monteverdi bought one of those violins for his nephew. And that's exactly the same time that Monteverdi was writing his Vespers to try to audition for the place composer in the Sistine Chapel. So that's reasonably the kind of place where that instrument would have been played for such an important time. And we don't play music in the Sistine Chapel anymore, or in the acoustic of a Sistine Chapel. It's fascinating when you go into sort of medieval acoustics. If you ever go into church and notice the choir on the choir stalls have actually got wooden floorboards underneath, and you think which idiot went and created choir stalls for choir boys to sit on with wooden floorboards which are going to be creaky. And the secret is that underneath those you've got these great big pits which are pulled out, which are dug out, which are acoustic chambers. Even from where the choir is into when you go into the main body of the church, you often see pillars which reduce the size of, just momentarily reduce and separate the choir from the rest of the church. And that creates a Helmholtz resonance, which is it's the same thing which makes noise as the way that the sound holes on a violin power that internal noise into a great big space. So you've got, even in the medieval times, you've got these great musical instruments called churches. And the medieval world was not interested in hearing the choir boy's voice. They weren't interested in the kind of human voice that they could hear if you took the choir outside and got them to sing. What they're actually interested in is in the closest thing that humans could get to God. So by using all of these acoustical ideas and tricks in order to boost the choir's voice to a celestial quality, or at least to the closest that mankind could get to celestial quality, was the whole point of church design from a musical perspective. So you've got that which sort of coming through right through into the Baroque period and so forth. So when I go to King's Place, for example, not very far from here, and hear a Baroque performance where I can hear exactly the voices of everybody because it's got a recording studio kind of dead acoustic. It's really amazing to hearing 16th century voices sung like that. But you know that Josquin de Prez, one of those great composers of that time, would be tearing his head at Hebbert because that's not music as he envisaged. It's music entirely in the realm of human beings rather than the celestial stuff. And yet, actually, early music is more interested in that than it is in that purity of the instruments in the 21st century than the architecture gives. When you get to violins in the 17th century, there's a great divide between Northern European and Southern European instruments. And a theory that I've got, madcap as it may be, I mean, if you get to know me, I've got lots of madcap ideas, is that when I walk through a town in Italy and I snap my fingers, I hear resonance all the time. And I hear resonance because the architecture of Italy is one of stone, predominantly, because it's a country where it's very often warm, and everything in the way the buildings is created is in order to keep the buildings cool. You go into a 16th century palazzo, and it's a cool building despite how much sun there is, because that's what the architecture contains. Because it's stone architecture, you've got any instrument that you play, any kind of music is going to have a huge reverberation to it. You go into Germany, and that's where you get Steiner, who creates a completely different kind of violin, realised that with something like that, you get a very laser-like sound. You get something very direct, which you can move around with using a musician's skill. With a Northern European instrument, it's got a lot more comfort to it. So instead of that directness, you get sort of, it's fluffy, and it's got that sort of luxurious quality to it without very much direction. But then you go into a Northern European building which is predominantly made out of plaster and wood, because and would predominantly have leather hangings on the walls and things like that. And you actually find that you don't go around a Northern European city and hear resonance, because all of the buildings are made out of materials of damp sound, because materials of damp sound are actually very good insulating materials to keep you warm in winter. So then you take your Steiner, and what you realise is that in a dampened acoustic, a Steiner is a beautiful instrument to play, because internally it's got that luxuriousness and that resonance. Whereas in Italy you don't need that, because the buildings provide that resonance. So when we get to sort of concert halls, particularly for sort of historical instruments or historical ways of playing, you get that sort of tension that I think so many instruments, particularly in Italy, are designed in order to play the room. And that's also what you get in English churches with all the medieval tricks. In Moorish mosques you get acoustic pots in different areas in order to sort of push the music. And I think understanding the music almost more than the instruments, and understanding the places where that exists, you get a very different sound map from anything that any one individual concert hall can give. And with that, I think we have to make compromises, of course we do, but particularly when you go in here, 16th century polyphony in King's Place, which is, you end up with fetishes which are not so much a concert hall, that's very much driven by ideologies which musicians have at certain times. You can end up with something which is completely anachronistic to how something was ever intended to be. I'm not sure how much it's your responsibility as architects to mediate between that. And I guess the customer's always right when it comes to building. Yes.
Absolutely. I have a friend of mine who is a violin teacher in schools and also plays the rock violin.
Yes.
And can you explain what is the difference between modern violin and the other violins you play?
There's a huge number of differences that we can talk about, but essentially it has crackback strings which work at a much lower tension. That's why when we played them earlier, you got that much softer, sweeter sound on the violin Atlantic against a sort of powerhouse sound. But actually, because they're softer, when you're playing the violin with modern strings, it's like playing against steel rocks. So you can answer this better than I can, but
it's kind of the margin for error you play on a violin like this. The strings are at higher tension because the top's actually been reinforced slightly on the inside to cope with that. Because everything's sort of higher tension, I'm not explaining this very well, you can play in a lot, sort of many different styles, and you can really sort of attack the violin. But it'll still sound. It's far more resilient because of its sort of the higher tension. Whereas this, if I just do exactly the same thing on that now.
But one thing that you can do on that is you can bend the strings, and that gives you another dimension of sound, which you lose on a modern violin.
If I do exactly the same thing, then we have sort of all this sort of not particularly pleasant. Yeah. So
if I can risk playing after you.
Please, I'll sit down here.
There's a particular bit of bark which, and I'm playing it really, really badly because I don't want to help you. But the point of there's a very natural way, which I'm not really expressing very well, being able to sort of bend the notes when playing this, which just comes with gut strings, which, I mean, if you hear Menuhin playing the same thing before, there's a great Menuhin recording where he's just and that's the way that he tries to deal with it, because as a modern violinist, looking at something from an entirely modern perspective, he doesn't have that ability to bend the notes and to turn them into something which is very natural. And then when you play, because you've been trained in a sort of in a style which actually takes into account these things, you're able to do it very beautifully on a modern violin, even though that's not necessarily natural for violin. So for some music it's just much more natural.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? You've answered most of my first question, but if you put catgut on both, those you've tried initially, would they sound very similar?
Yeah.
If you like for like.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, what does the scrolling marks do? If those were filled in, what would it sound like?
Sorry,
These ones here, the fronts. Yeah.
If they were filled in, what would?
it would significantly change. So there's essentially when the physics of a violin is if you take an electric guitar and you don't have it plugged in and you listen to the sound that it's making, it's probably a bit like that's actually more than you get from an electric guitar, because actually an electric guitar, the reason why it looks like a breadboard, and I'm not being rude about electric guitars, is because the whole physics of an electric guitar is to have an inert platform on which the strings go, so that everything about the strings turns into an electronic impulse. It's very important that it is not a musical instrument, and that's the whole design of it, and I will get murdered for saying that. What you have is you have a certain amount of energy in the string, which is exactly the same as an electric guitar. That's actually impeded by the bridge, because energy has to be lost as that energy goes through the bridge. So now you're talking about a tiny amount of energy at all hitting the body. The body vibrates with that energy. That vibrates the inner cavity of air. And what that inner cavity does is that you've got, just in the sound holes, you've got these what we call Helmholtz resonances. And that's that air actually has its own particular mass. And it's the way that sort of flaps around which pushes everything. So you've actually got, because of these, you've increased the volume of the instrument by about 100 times. So there's vast science about the architecture. Of course, these weren't done out of science, but there is vast science about how the sound holes work.
Because I thought most of it came from the surface, the main.
No, it's basically they're shooting out. With a double bass, you can play with a candle just there, and the amount of air that shoots out of those is such that you can blow the candle out just by playing the double bass.
You think maybe listening wanted
It's hopefully I've got to repair it if it does.
Just connect to that. Does the F holes make a different sound from receiver?
Have you been reading the Telegraph yesterday?
Yeah.
Because there was a big article about why Stradivarius sound better than other things, which was a whole load of hokum. There is, what's really interesting is that this area here has to flex, and you've actually got the best possible shape to be able to maintain. This is the core of the energy of the instrument. It makes sense to make slits which go up and down either side. It makes sense to reduce a bit here, and it also makes sense to reduce a bit here. So if you're designing something on AutoCAD based on finite element analysis or something like that, starting with slits to allow this to flex, and to give, it's the flexibility here which is the main engine which powers the air cavity. You're going to realise that snipping it there and snipping it there is going to make it 10 times more powerful.
Which is why they're loud and loud.
Which is why they're loud. There's other reasons why a violin which has got C holes, you've got the shape here is very sophisticated. You've got a catenary curve for the inside and you've got a curved cycloid for the outside. It's that combination. On a viol you've just got a flat back like you have on a guitar, and that's not able to resonate in any way the same way. And there is, I think, if you go back to when the violin existed, I'd say in the Corte d'Isabella d'Este in the 1490s, which is, you've got two kinds of music. You've got flutes which play, well, you've got recorders which play sort of intelligent music, and you've got sackbuts and cornets which do dance music. And actually it's the violin which takes over from the dance music, and the viol takes over from flutes, but almost sort of retarded something. I think the viol has got, the ribs are 3 times as deep, so the energy dissipates over a bigger area. It's got this flat back. Everything's done in the viol to retard it as an instrument, and again that can get me shocked by some people. But it's so that it has that dull flute-like sound, which is very, very important for the ideas of music that it's built for. Yes.
When we're designing buildings,
Yeah.
can you suggest some ways in which we can acoustically create spaces for every day? So maybe one's trying to create a space where you can concentrate very deeply and be very peaceful, or maybe a space where there's not a hubbub and you're trying to create a buzz, like an event space or something.
It's tricky. I mean, what I've seen that's been done, actually it's really great. My office is in Somerset House, and I'm really lucky. But one of the great things, it's by one of the major stairwells, and when people are, when on a weekend when no one else is there, I've got a great acoustic within my showroom. But if I open the door, I've got this absolutely vast chamber about the size of a concert hall just outside the door. And the difference just between people playing in my room or just opening the door, it's like on a Yamaha Clavinova, there's electric pianos, you have buttons and you get a concert hall space and whatever, and it just, that sort of thing just opens up and completely changes the space. And I know that there's some concert halls where there's sort of complete second chambers in exactly the same way, which are used in order to work the orchestra in a certain way. And I think I'm obviously completely avoiding your question. But where I'm sort of coming to your question is that I think that there are opportunities in perfect concert hall that you could have chambers behind the orchestra which have an acoustic purpose, which you could then seal off. So there's no reason why you can't have, I mean, I'm sure there are every reason why you can't have cost being one and possibly physics being another, but wouldn't it be wonderful if you could have a concert hall which could give a pure studio acoustic, and then just by opening up some backdrops, you could then have a great sort of...
Birmingham has resonant chambers.
Okay, yeah.
You open doors and there's rooms in the auditorium actually that give a sort of a Helmholtz resonance. They are big. You can get a family saloon in there.
Yeah, so that kind of thing in order to altering the mood within the concert hall. But it seems too complex a question to zone a concert hall according to different moods.
I think I'm wary of time, so I think we can have one more question and then, okay.
You said if you use the same strings on the oldest
Yeah.
and this one, they sound similar. So what makes the old one so much more valuable?
Violins are a really strange thing. It's magic. That's the easiest way of getting around sort of a 3-hour conversation. What people have discovered who are greater than me and at different times in the past is that old instruments, just like we take it for granted that good wine gets better with age. What makes a valuable instrument tends to be that it's made well. If an instrument's made badly, this honestly is not made as well as it was. So it doesn't matter how old it gets and how changed it is, it's just going to be a changed, not that good violin. Against if you make something and the architecture is absolutely there. I sort of feel that when I've said architecture 10 times, everyone's just sort of getting the same thing again. But if the architecture is right and the instrument ages well, then it produces an incredible sound. And that's why Stradivari violins, in honesty, I think that there are makers today who make violins as well as Stradivari. And if you could transport those 300 years back, you wouldn't tell the difference. The problem is that those violins are 300 years old and they've improved over time. It gives a better sound, but it also gives better response, so they're much more versatile too. And that's also where I pay money.
Do the old ones wear out?
Well, here's the interesting thing. Even in the 1820s, there's something which I read, not that I was there in the 1820s, but benefit of libraries, but where there was a maker called Jean-Baptiste Guillaume, and he was saying, look, these instruments, they're the greatest instruments, they're already 120 years, they're 100 years old. It makes absolute sense that they have to wear out. And this is actually sort of the answer that I give to people who want to invest is, look, well, you can buy a Stradivari made in 1710, and yes, it must wear out. There's no plausible reason that it can't. But that instrument there was made 100 years before, and that hasn't started to wear out. And there are other instruments, amazingly, in the hands of musicians which were made in the 1560s. Lawrence Power is playing tonight at the Wigmore Hall in Renzi, which is about 1580s. And that hasn't been.
I think a very interesting thing about this violin in particular, it was built in 1610, but actually the wood that Maggini used when he made it, I think I'm right in saying this, am I not?
Yes, well, depends on which
Well, it's what I'm going to say. The wood, when he, in 1610, when he made the violin, the wood was already 200 years old.
Yeah.
It was, the tree was felled in 1405
is the youngest tree ring day.
And certainly when I play this, it is sort of, it's loud, it's resonant, it works. It doesn't. There's no hint of. I don't play it, and I think sort of it sounds sort of fatigued and old, and
Is it the same bridge?
No,
that's about 2 weeks old actually. But logic dictates that these things have to become relics at some time or other, and.
There are certain parts that wear out, the heads, the fingerboards were developed as trenches, so you put a new fingerboard on the strings, of course, but the sort of the majority of the instrument remains the same from century to century.
Okay. I really hate to do this, but I think Ben, do you mind hanging out with us for a beer? And if anyone has any more questions, then feel free to ask. Thank you both very much.